Today we're going to be working with a conceptual framework that can help you analyze the rhetoric of any type of communication. The goal of this video is for you to understand the rhetorical triangle as a tool to analyze your text for your RA essay. This is a rhetorical triangle. It was developed by Andrea Lunsford and Cheryl Glenn. But if you Google a rhetorical triangle, you may see several different variations of this triangle. And some of you may be familiar with a slightly different one. In this class, however, we're going to use this version of the rhetorical triangle. There are 3 points on this triangle. There's the sender, the receiver, and the message. And they all interact with each other, and that's represented through these arrows. Through the interaction of the sender, the receiver, and the message, meaning is created. And this rhetorical triangle is used to analyze text. It posits that the sender is communicating with the receiver, but how the receiver understands the sender and going back and forth helps create meaning in just the same way as how the receiver understands the message and how the sender understands the message. In other words, there's no such thing as an inherent meaning of a text. It's always being created through the interactions of these different elements. It's important to note that the rhetorical triangle can be applied to all forms of communication, from books and emails to phone calls and speeches, and even talking to your mom. Now let's take a deeper look at the different points of this triangle. First, we have the sender. The sender can also be called the author and the speaker. And fundamentally, they're just the person who produced the text. And the text can be any type of communication. Remember, it can be a phone call, it could be a book. If we return back to our class article, Choosing a School for Our Daughter in a Segregated City, we know that the sender is Nicole Hannah Jones. And here's a picture of Hannah Jones. Whenever we think about the sender and start analyzing the sender in terms of rhetoric, we can also consider several characteristics about the sender. Things like their background, their objectives for producing their text, the indoxa or the common knowledge the person has and shares with the reader, and the reader's expectations for her. So for example, we know that Hannah Jones has an incredible ethos on the topic of school segregation. She's a New York Times Magazine writer, and the New York Times Magazine is a very prestigious publication. And in 2017, she won the MacArthur Genius Grant for writing this article. And so we know in this case, her background, she's incredibly knowledgeable, and that is communicated to the reader. We then also will want to consider, of course, the audience. And the audience can also be called the receiver, the listener, the reader, the person who receives this text, this communication. And just like the sender, we can look at the background of the audience. We can look at their objectives for engaging with the text, who they are. We can look at their indoxa, what they know about the topic, their common knowledge, and their interpretations and the expectations for the text. However, it's not just as simple as identifying an audience. Oftentimes, students will think, well, the audience is anybody who can read. It can be anybody. In reality, texts are created for specific audiences, and we want to think about the difference between the intended audience and the actual audience. And texts are always circulating, so we've always got more than one audience to consider. The intended audience is the person the writer was writing to, so the person intended to write to. While the actual audience is all these other people who actually happen to read it. For example, you all read the article for our class. This article was published in the New York Times Magazine. My guess is that you don't normally read the New York Times Magazine, which is a publication known for its long-form journalism. My guess is that you're more likely to read the website BuzzFeed. Sound about right? So who was Hannah Jones' intended audience? In 2017, Hannah Jones explained that she believed the article spoke to white, liberal, older, people who are parents, educated audiences more than any of her other writings. And when examining the rhetorical strategies in her article, we always want to consider how they appeal to this particular audience. How is she drawing in a white audience versus maybe a black audience? How is she thinking about a liberal audience versus maybe a more conservative one? And how does her text reflect the fact that she was writing for a very specific audience? Lastly, as part of our triangle, we want to look at the message of the text. And this is probably the part of the triangle you're most familiar with because it's what we focus on often in English classes. And it's often the focus of literary analysis, is looking at the message. What is the text saying about something? I picked out this paragraph at the end of Hannah Jones's article as one of the messages of her text. Of course, we could have an argument about what is the key message, but I think this one is a good paragraph that gives a good idea of what she is saying in this text. Of course, with the message, you can also consider how that message is being conveyed. Things like framing, which we discussed in class, dissociation, and then finally this concept of rhetorical velocity. So to conclude, when thinking about the rhetorical triangle, we need to consider the sender, the receiver, and the message, and then how these interact with each other to create meaning. With these concepts in mind, I want you to work on completing your rhetorical analysis pre-writing activity and pay particular attention to how the author is using ethos, logos, and pathos to appeal to a particular audience. Remember, it's not talking to everybody, but who is that audience? And how it's doing that in order to convey the message of the text. What is that message of the text?